There is a place in the Colorado mountains where time stops, not metaphorically, not poetically, literally, institutionally. By design. It sits in the high desert outside Florence, Colorado, and remarkable from the road, a flat complex of concrete and razor wire, swallowed by a landscape that feels intentionally empty. No signs announce its significance. No crowds gather outside its gates, but inside those walls, some of the most closely watched human beings on Earth are spending their lives in near total silence. Before we go further, if you found this documentary, you're exactly the kind of viewer we made it for. Subscribe if you haven't. Leave a comment below. What you're about to hear deserves to be heard by as many people as possible, because here is what almost no one talks about. Inside ADX Florence, the federal government's only Supermax prison, men wake up every morning to the same concrete ceiling. They eat alone. They exercise alone. They think alone. For 23 hours a day, they are sealed inside a cell roughly the size of a parking space. The walls do not move. The light does not change. The routine does not deviate. And for many of them, this has been true not for weeks or months, but for years. For decades. The question that haunts this documentary isn't whether dangerous men deserve punishment. That question has already been answered by the courts, the law, the system. The question is something harder. Something the system rarely asks itself. What does 23 hours of daily isolation actually do to a human mind? And who is responsible for what happens after? ADX Florence opened in 1994, built in the aftermath of two federal prison murders that shook the Bureau of Prisons to its core. Officials called it the solution, the last resort, the answer to violence that no other facility could contain. It was designed, deliberately and methodically, to eliminate human connection. Solid steel doors replaced traditional bars. Inmates could not see each other. A concrete exercise yard, roughly the size of a shipping container, stood in for the outdoors. Meals arrived through a slot in the door. Medical visits happened through the same slot. The architecture itself was the punishment. Former correctional staff who worked there, some speaking years after leaving, described the environment as unlike anything else in American corrections. One former officer, speaking to investigative journalists, called it a place designed so that nothing happens. That was the intention. Absolute control. Absolute stillness. But absolute stillness, it turns out, has consequences that the designers may not have fully anticipated. The men sent to ADX are not ordinary inmates. The roster over the decades has included bombers, terrorists, cartel leaders, and individuals whose crimes defined news cycles for years. Their names were once everywhere: courtrooms, front pages, cable news, CHYRONs. And then, slowly, they disappeared. Not from the prison, from the world's awareness. Behind those steel doors, they became something the outside world rarely contemplated: human beings frozen in time, cut off from every social thread that makes a person feel real. This documentary is about that disappearance. Not just of freedom, not just of privacy, but of personhood itself, and what that slow erasure reveals about the system that engineered it. There is a word architects use when designing spaces meant to calm people. That word is flow, the idea that space should guide human movement naturally, organically. ADX Florence was designed with the opposite intention entirely. Every corridor, every doorway, every material choice was made to stop movement. To interrupt it, to end it. Former Bureau of Prisons documents describe the facility as containing over 1,400 remotely operated steel doors. No door opens without authorization from a control room. An inmate can travel from his cell to the shower at 12 feet and pass through to separate locking mechanisms. The shower itself runs on a timer. It stops automatically. Nothing inside ADX Florence happens on a human schedule. Everything happens on an institutional one. Architects and criminologists who have studied the facility described it as a masterpiece of control engineering. Every surface is designed to eliminate opportunity for violence, for communication, for anything unscripted. But several researchers have noted something the original designers may not have intended to build. They built, almost perfectly, the physical conditions that clinical psychologists associate with severe sensory deprivation. Dr. Stuart Gracian, a Harvard-trained psychiatrist, spent years studying inmates held in solitary confinement across American prisons. His findings published across multiple academic papers and cited in federal litigation, described a recognizable psychiatric syndrome emerging in isolated prisoners: hypersensitivity to sound, perceptual distortions, paranoia, and inability to concentrate that worsened progressively. Over time, some inmates described hearing voices in the ventilation system. Others lost the capacity to track how many days had passed. The cell, Dr. Gracian wrote, became less a punishment and more a psychological environment with its own dangerous internal weather. Inside ADX, the cells measure approximately 7 by 12 feet. There is a concrete bed, a concrete desk, a concrete stool, a small television, mounted high on the wall, delivers programming, educational channels, approved content, a narrow window into a world that no longer includes the inmate watching it. There is a thin window, set deep into the wall, that allows a sliver of natural light. Former inmates who have since been released, a small number, under specific circumstances, have described that sliver of light as the most important thing in the cell. Some said they spent hours watching it move. Tracking sunlight became the only way to feel time passing at all. What the architecture accomplished, beyond security, was erasure, not of the body. The body was fed, clothed, and kept alive with institutional precision. What slowly disappeared was the social self, the part of a person that exists only in relationship to others. Psychologists call this the relational self. It requires contact to survive. At ADX, contact was rationed like a controlled substance. 1 hour of solitary outdoor exercise. Occasional case manager visits through the door. Limited telephone calls, sometimes restricted further as disciplinary measures. Letters screened, delayed, sometimes returned. A 2012 lawsuit filed on behalf of ADX inmates, Cunningham v. Federal Bureau of Prisons, alleged that the facility was systematically denying mental health care to inmates with severe psychiatric conditions. The complaint described men who had deteriorated significantly inside the facility, men who arrived broken and left years later more broken still. The Bureau of Prisons disputed the characterizations. The case eventually settled. The terms were not fully disclosed. That settlement sits at the center of something this documentary keeps returning to: not the violence that put these men inside, not the crimes, not the verdicts, but the silence that followed them, and a silence so complete, so engineered, so deliberately maintained that even its consequences became difficult to see from the outside, and that, perhaps, was always part of the design. There is a particular kind of forgetting that institutions rely on, not the forgetting of courts, or accords, or official histories, but the forgetting of the public, the slow, natural erosion of attention that follows any story once the cameras leave. ADX. Florence has always understood this dynamic. Intuitively, its most powerful security feature was never the steel doors or the remote-controlled locks. It was invisibility. Consider what happens to a name after sentencing. For months, sometimes years, it dominates headlines. It fills courtrooms. It becomes a cultural reference point. And then the gavel falls. The van drives away. The coverage moves on. What remains, inside a 7 by 12 cell in the Colorado desert, is a human being the world has collectively decided it no longer needs to think about. ADX Florence has housed some of the most significant criminal cases in modern American history: the Unabomber, the Oklahoma City bombing conspirators, September 11th planners, cartel leadership, names that, at the moment of their crimes, seemed too large for any single institution to contain. And yet, containment happened, quietly, completely. Advocates who have spent years trying to maintain contact with ADX inmates describe a wall not metaphorical but procedural that makes sustained human connection nearly impossible. Phone call approvals can take months. Visitation requires layers of clearance that many families cannot navigate. Letters disappear into screening processes that offer no timeline and no transparency. One area that researchers and legal advocates have documented repeatedly concerns the population of mentally -1 inmates held at ADX. The 2012 litigation revealed allegations that men with diagnosed psychiatric conditions as schizophrenia, severe depression, documented histories of self-harm had been housed in Isolation conditions that appeared to worsen their symptoms. Dramatically. Court filings described incidents of profound deterioration, men who stopped communicating entirely, men who exhibited symptoms, clinicians associated with psychotic breaks, and whose behavior inside the facility led to disciplinary measures, which led to further isolation, which led to further deterioration, a cycle. Advocates argued that the institution seemed structurally unable to interrupt. The Bureau of Prisons maintained consistently that ADX provided appropriate mental health services, that clinical staff were available, that protocols existed, that the facility operated within established legal and medical standards. But the settlement and the continued advocacy of organizations like the CLU and the Center for Constitutional Rights suggested that the gap between official policy and daily reality was significant, and largely invisible to anyone not inside those walls. There is a name that appears repeatedly in the documentation surrounding ADX mental health litigation, not an inmate's name. A category. Step-down program. The Bureau of Prisons designed a process by which inmates could theoretically earn their way out of the highest isolation tier, demonstrating good behavior, engaging with programming, progressing toward a less restrictive environment. Former inmates and their advocates have described the step-down program as real in structure and inconsistent in practice. Progress could be reversed by a single disciplinary infractions. In an environment of extreme stress and documented psychiatric deterioration were not uncommon. The latter existed, but the runs, for many, proved impossible to hold. And so they remained. Seasons passed outside the thin cell windows. Administrations changed in Washington. The names on the outside faded further from public conversation. Inside, the men aged. Some developed chronic physical conditions. Some deteriorated psychologically beyond what visiting clinicians could stabilize with available resources. Some, according to advocates with direct correspondence access, simply stopped trying to communicate with the outside world at all. Not because they were prevented, because after enough years, they could no longer remember how. Here is what this documentary cannot tell you with certainty. It cannot tell you exactly what happens behind those steel doors on any given day. It cannot tell you how many men are currently in the most restrictive isolation tier, or what their mental health status is tonight. The Bureau of Prisons does not release that information. Not fully, not transparently. What this documentary can tell you is this: there are men inside ADX Florence right now who have not had a meaningful human conversation in years, and the system that placed them there has no legal obligation to tell you or anyone what that silence is doing to them. Stay with us, because what comes next changes everything you think you understand about how this place actually operates. There are very few people who can tell you what ADX Florence feels like from the inside. The institution does not invite testimony. It does not encourage reflection, and most of the men who enter its highest security tiers remain there for the rest of their natural lives. But some do leave. A small number, through legal challenges, sentence modifications, or step-down program completion, have eventually transitioned out of ADX into lower security federal facilities, and what they carried with them when they left told investigators, advocates, and clinicians something the official record rarely captured. Reentry specialists and prison reform advocates who have worked directly with former Supermax inmates describe a consistent profile, not a profile of danger, not of volatility, a profile of profound disorientation. Men who had spent years in near total isolation emerged with difficulty navigating spaces that contained other people, the presence of multiple voices in a room, ordinary conversation, background noise, the simple overlap of human sound that could produce acute anxiety responses in men who had once functioned normally in social environments. Some former inmates described an inability to make eye contact that persisted for months after release. Others spoke of a compulsive need to return to small, enclosed spaces, finding open rooms overwhelming, disorienting, almost threatening. Psychologists have a clinical framework for understanding these responses. Prolonged isolation fundamentally alters the way the brain processes social information. The neural pathways associated with reading facial expressions, interpreting tone of voice, and regulating responses to unexpected stimuli can weaken significantly without regular use. It is not metaphor. It is measurable neurological change. Dr. Craig Haney, a psychology professor at the University of California, Santa Cruz, spent decades studying the effects of solitary confinement on the American prison population. His research described what he called social pathologies emerging in isolated inmates. Not pre-existing conditions, but responses generated by the environment itself. The prison, his work suggested, was producing the very dysfunction it claimed to be managing. Former inmates who have spoken publicly through advocacy organizations, legal depositions, and carefully documented interviews have described the experience of time at ADX in terms that are remarkably consistent. Time does not pass inside ADX. It accumulates. Days become indistinguishable. Weeks dissolve into each other without markers. One man, speaking through an advocacy organization after his transfer to a lower security facility, described losing the ability to remember which year he was in during his middle period of isolation. Not which day, which year. He knew, intellectually, that time had passed. He could not feel it having done so. This temporal dislocation has consequences that extend far beyond the psychological. Men who emerge from long-term Supermax isolation frequently struggle with practical reintegration tasks that most people perform without conscious thought. Managing money, navigating public transportation, ordering food in a restaurant. The world outside continued evolving during their isolation. Technology, social norms, economic realities all shifted. They did not shift with it. They stepped out of a static environment into a moving one. Carrying a decade or more of arrested adaptation, advocates argue that this outcome is not an accident. It is, they contend, the predictable result of a system that prioritizes institutional control over human restoration. ADX was designed to neutralize, not to rehabilitate, not to prepare. The Bureau of Prisons has consistently maintained that programming opportunities exist within the facility, that education, religious services, and mental health support are available to qualifying inmates, but former inmates and their legal representatives have described a significant gap between available programming and actual access, particularly for those in the most restrictive housing tiers. What sits at the center of this gap is a question of intent. Did the architects of ADX Florence design a facility that would permanently damage the people inside it? Almost certainly not. The stated intention was control, security, containment. But intention and outcome are not always the same thing. And between those two realities, what the institution intended and what the institution produced, there is a space where something deeply uncomfortable lives, something that formal reports do not fully capture, something that only the men who survived it can describe, and most of them, even now, find it extraordinarily difficult to put into words. There is a particular kind of accountability that looks like accountability without functioning as it. It has forms. It has processes. It has official language and designated oversight bodies. But when the doors are thick enough and the population invisible enough, oversight can become a performance staged primarily for the people performing it. The Federal Bureau of Prisons operates under the jurisdiction of the Department of Justice. It is subject to congressional oversight, internal inspection, and review by the Office of the Inspector General. On paper, the architecture of accountability is substantial. In practice, researchers, legal advocates, and former staff have described something more complicated. The OIG, the Office of the Inspector General, has produced reports over the years examining conditions within federal detention facilities. Some of those reports identified significant deficiencies, staffing shortages, mental health care gaps, inadequate medical response protocols. The reports were filed, recommendations were issued, follow-up investigations sometimes found the same deficiencies persisting years later. The cycle of identification and non-resolution became, for some advocates, as troubling as the original problems themselves. Congressional oversight of ADX Florence specifically has been limited by a factor that is rarely discussed openly. The inmates housed there are by design and by public consensus, among the least sympathetic human beings in American life. Advocating for their conditions requires a political willingness to be seen advocating for them. That willingness, across administrations and across party lines, has historically been rare. The result is a facility that exists in a peculiar political blind spot, too secure to be ignored as a security matter, too controversial to be examined as a human rights matter. It occupies a space where serious scrutiny becomes almost structurally impossible. Legal challenges have provided the most consistent external pressure on ADX conditions. The 2012 Cunningham litigation was not the first, and it was not the last. Organizations including the CLU National Prison Project have maintained sustained legal attention on Supermax conditions across the American prison system. But litigation moves slowly. Discovery is contested. Settlements are sealed. And between the filing of a complaint and its resolution, years pass inside those cells regardless. Former Bureau of Prisons staff who have spoken to journalists and researchers after leaving the agency describe an internal culture that is not indifferent to inmate welfare. Most correctional officers, they suggest, are neither cruel nor negligent by disposition, but institutional culture shapes behavior in ways that individual disposition cannot always override. When the measure of a successful shift is the absence of incident rather than the presence of meaningful human interaction, what gets prioritized reflects that metric. Silence becomes the definition of success, and in that silence, deterioration can proceed largely unnoticed until it becomes impossible to ignore. There is a documented phenomenon in institutional psychology called institutional syndrome, sometimes referred to as prisonization, and it describes the gradual adoption of an institution's norms, values, and behavioral expectations by the people inside it. It applies to inmates, but researchers have noted that it applies, in different forms, to staff as well. Long-term correctional workers in high-security environments can develop a normalized relationship with conditions that outside observers would find deeply troubling. Not through malice, through exposure, through the slow calibration of what seems ordinary. What this means for oversight is significant. The people best positioned to observe conditions at ADX Florence daily are the people most likely, over time, to have normalized those conditions. External oversight bodies visit periodically. They see prepared environments and scheduled interactions. They produce reports based on what is made visible to them. What remains invisible? The daily texture of isolation, the incremental deterioration, the quiet and undocumented suffering exists in a space that formal oversight was never fully designed to reach. And so the system watches itself, with genuine process and genuine limitation existing simultaneously. With real accountability mechanisms producing real blind spots, with a facility that is, by almost every external measure, functioning exactly as designed, while inside, in cells that have not changed in 30 years. The question of what functioning as designed actually costs remains largely unanswered, and largely unasked. There is a question that this documentary has been circling since the first frame. Not the question of guilt, not the question of danger. Those questions were answered in courtrooms, by juries, under the full weight of American law. The question this documentary has been asking is quieter, harder, more uncomfortable. What does a society reveal about itself by the conditions it is willing to maintain out of sight, out of mind, behind doors it never has to open? ADX Florence is still operational today. The steel doors still close at the same intervals. The meals still arrive through the same slots. Somewhere in that Colorado desert tonight, men are lying on concrete beds, listening to the same ventilation hum they have heard for years. Some of them have been there long enough that the world they remember no longer exists in its original form. The cities they knew have changed. The people they loved have aged, moved, or died. Technology has transformed daily life in ways they have experienced only through a narrow television screen mounted high on a concrete wall. Debate around solitary confinement in America has shifted meaningfully over the past 2 decades. Growing body of medical and psychiatric consensus now holds that prolonged isolation causes measurable, lasting psychological harm. The United Nations Standard Minimum Rules for the treatment of prisoners are known as the Nelson Mandela Rules that define solitary confinement exceeding 15 consecutive days as cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. The United States has not formally adopted that standard for its federal facilities. ADX Florence, under current policy, operates outside that international threshold by a significant margin. Reform advocates have made incremental progress in some areas. Several states have introduced legislation limiting solitary confinement duration and restricting its use for vulnerable populations of juveniles, pregnant women, those with serious mental illness. At the federal level, movement has been slower and more contested. The Bureau of Prisons has introduced programming adjustments over the years, modifying certain step-down procedures and expanding some mental health resources. Whether those adjustments have meaningfully changed the daily reality for inmates in the most restrictive tiers remains largely a matter of dispute between the institution and those monitoring it from outside. What is not in dispute is this: the human brain was not designed for the conditions ADX Florence imposes. It was designed for contact, for variation, for the irreplaceable neurological nourishment of ordinary human presence. When that nourishment is removed systematically over years, the damage that accumulates is not theoretical. It is documented, it is measurable, it is real, and it does not disappear when a man is eventually transferred, released, or dies inside those walls. There are families who have spent decades trying to maintain a relationship with someone inside ADX. Mothers who have navigated labyrinthine correspondence systems to send birthday letters that may or may not arrive. Children who grew up writing to a father they were too young to remember meeting. Spouses who built entire parallel lives around the rhythm of restricted phone calls and delayed mail. The isolation of ADX does not stay inside ADX. It radiates outward, quietly and persistently, into the lives of everyone connected to the men behind those doors. And then there is the larger question, the one that sits beneath every statistic, every court filing, every advocacy report, every clinical study. If a person is isolated completely enough, for long enough, do they remain the same person who entered? The neuroscience suggests they do not. Not entirely. The psychology suggests the self that emerges from prolonged isolation is a self that has been genuinely altered by the experience of surviving it, which raises something that American criminal justice rarely pauses to ask. If punishment is intended, at some level, to be delivered to the person who committed the crime, what does it mean when the person who endures it has been changed by the punishment itself into someone different? There are no clean answers at the end of this documentary. There are no villains whose removal would resolve what you have just witnessed. There is a facility, there is a population, there is a system of oversight that functions imperfectly or on both, and there is a country that built ADX Florence, funds it, and largely chooses not to think about what happens inside it on a given Tuesday afternoon. That choice, a collective, quiet, and ongoing, is perhaps the most honest thing this documentary can leave you with. Not outrage, not resolution. Just the simple and comfortable weight of knowing ADX Florence will open for another day tomorrow. The doors will cycle, the meals will arrive, the ventilation will hum. And somewhere in the Colorado high desert, in a cell the size of a parking space, a man will watch a sliver of morning light move slowly across a concrete floor. Measuring time the only way still available to him, watching the light. Waiting. If this documentary made you think or made you feel something difficult and true, then it did what it was made to do. There are more stories like this one. Stories that live in the gaps of official records, in sealed settlements, in the silence between institutional statements. If you want to keep exploring them with us, the next documentary is waiting. Thank you for watching. Thank you for staying until the end.